Good evening. I'm Dr. Vincent Baycoat. I am the director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. And together with our student development group and Taylor University and St. Mark's Glen Ellen, we welcome you to an event that we're very, very excited about. We live in a world that is increasingly given the label of being pluralistic. But we are in great need of wisdom as to how to live in that world, and particularly how to live in that world in a way where we can live with integrity in terms of our identity, especially our faith identity. And tonight we have two guests with us who are going to help us think through that challenge. To my far left is Eboo Patel, the founder and executive director of the Interfaith Youth Corps. To my immediate left is Skye Jethani, who has many positions with Christianity Today Incorporated and is also an ordained pastor. They're both natives of Glen Ellen. They both went to school together, and they both have thought deeply about this issue tonight. And it's a tremendous opportunity for us to learn and to engage them in dialogue. So before they speak to us, I'm going to invite Reverend George Smith from St. Mark's Glen Ellen to come and give us a word of prayer.
Good evening. I have before me the Book of Common Prayer, which as an Anglican Episcopalian, this is one of our two key foundations. The other one, of course, is the Holy Bible. And I'd like to read a prayer for you from it. It is for the social justice. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving Spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of those gathered here tonight, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatreds cease, that our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Well, I have the privilege of beginning our discussion this evening, and Eboo will follow me, and we'll have time for interaction with all of you. We're here to talk about the reality of religious pluralism in our age, but I want to begin with a story from an age past, about 800 years ago. In the 13th century, the Muslim and Christian worlds were in conflict with each other. Historians have called it a clash of civilizations. In that time period, the Crusades were going on. About 100 years of fighting back and forth as the Europeans tried to retake the Holy Lands from the advancement of Muslim armies in North Africa and the Middle East. In the middle of that, St. Francis of Assisi had a different vision for Christian-Muslim interaction, one other than battles and swords. So in 1219, he traveled with the European armies to North Egypt, and his desire was to present the gospel of Jesus Christ to his Muslim neighbors at least geographically, if not in the immediate proximity of Assisi. Against the wishes of the commander of the Christian army, Francis and another monk decided they were going to go across the battlefield barefoot and approach the city where the Sultan lived and ask to speak with him. And that's exactly what Francis did. Unarmed, barefoot, and wearing nothing but a robe, he went into the Muslim camp and asked to speak with the Sultan. This Sultan, who the Christian leaders had told him was a tyrant, was uneducated, and would probably torture you before they killed you. But Francis went anyway. And when the Sultan entered to greet this crazy Christian who had come across the battlefield barefoot, Francis greeted him by saying, "May the peace of God be with you." This caught the Sultan's attention, such a greeting from a Christian in a time of war. And then Francis introduced himself and his companion as ambassadors of Jesus Christ. The Sultan, knowing a thing or two about Christian ways at the time, realized this was a remarkable introduction. Francis did not introduce himself as an ambassador of the Pope or a representative of the Christian army, but as an ambassador of Jesus Christ. He understood that this man was coming as a representative of God, not a representative of Christian Europe. Well, Francis was also surprised by the Sultan. He turned out not to be a maniacal tyrant or an uneducated man, but a very subtle man, a student of philosophy, and very open-minded. The two of them engaged for days in exactly what Francis had hoped they would talk about, which was the gospel of Jesus Christ. The Sultan gave Francis free rein of his home. He enjoyed the warmest hospitality and was given an opportunity to share all he knew about the Christian faith, while the Sultan presented his understanding of Islam. And after multiple days together, the Sultan did not convert to Christianity, and Francis did not convert to Islam, but these two men modeled in a time of war a different way of interacting between faiths, one that was predicated on dialogue rather than destruction. In our age, we are seeing a rise in conflict and violence between the Christian community and the Muslim community. In some places, this has been a long-standing tension that's just simmered under the surface, but with recent political events bringing it to a rolling boil, like in the Sudan or in Iraq. In other places, however, it's a new sort of conflict as we see globalization and intercontinental migration happen. Muslim communities are growing in the West, and that's causing conflicts. You can think of recent events in Europe over the last couple of years where laws have been passed to prevent mosques from being built or from women wearing hijabs, or riots in the streets because Muhammad is depicted in a cartoon. We've seen it here in the United States. Just last summer, all the controversy over the so-called Ground Zero Mosque, the Cordoba House, and that pastor in Florida who threatened to burn the Quran. Now, that was an extreme example of tensions that are happening all over the country. In Nashville, there's a conflict going on about the building of a mosque. Right here in DuPage County, there are ongoing tensions about whether Hindus and Muslims should be allowed to build houses of worship. And some are accusing the authorities of discrimination. The tensions are rising. And this is why the story of Francis and the Sultan is helpful. Because if we don't look at another way of interacting, we too could fall into a trap of believing the only option is a clash of civilizations. That the only way that Christians and Muslims can interact is through conflict. There are certain powers in our culture today, both political, religious, even journalistic, that would like to see that clash happen. They have a vested interest in making sure it does. But just even using that term, clash of civilizations, is almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. In our imaginations, we can come to believe that the only way we can actually interact as faith communities is through conflict. We need examples of people who, like the Sultan and like Francis, want to carve out a different narrative, a different way that Christians and Muslims can interact, so that we can begin to imagine an alternative to just conflict. So my working premise in our conversation tonight, in my talk and in the time we'll interact, is this: peace in our world, stability in our communities, and even the health of the church requires that we find a more constructive way of interacting with our Muslim neighbors. And I believe in particular the evangelical community should be leading that effort. And what I want to talk about in the time I have left are two obstacles that are preventing evangelicals from engaging this good work. The first great obstacle, in my view, is fear. We've got two things happening simultaneously that are raising fears in the evangelical community. The first is that the church in the West, including in North America, is losing its privileged place in the society. Our ideas, both theologically and morally, are no longer going uncontested. So there's a decline in our prominence in the culture. At the same time, because of globalization and immigration and other things, we are seeing a visible increase in the Muslim community in the United States. Now, it comes nowhere near the 30% who identify themselves as evangelicals, but it's visible enough for opportunists who want to shake things up a little bit to make us afraid. So let me give you an example. One prominent national politician, in the midst of that Ground Zero controversy last summer, wrote this, quote, "America is experiencing an Islamist cultural political offensive designed to undermine and destroy our civilization." That's the kind of rhetoric that's being used to scare us about our Muslim neighbors. And this is just one example. There are many others in the media as different controversies erupt around the country. What this kind of rhetoric would have us believe is that, in this case, the building of an Islamic community center in Manhattan will somehow be a tipping point that destroys hundreds of years of Western legal thought, that will destroy the American civilization and somehow completely erode the Christian faith in North America. What opponents of that mosque may not have realized is that just 4 blocks from Ground Zero, there has been a mosque meeting for over 30 years. and somehow our republic has survived. The rhetoric is causing us to fear our Muslim neighbors. And if we believe, as the Crusaders did hundreds of years ago, that we are under attack, it's going to squelch any possibility of recasting the narrative away from conflict and toward cooperation. So, all this fear-mongering, unfortunately, is becoming commonplace in our partisan society, and it's happening both on conservative sides and progressive sides, among Christians and in some Muslim communities as well. The question is, can there be an alternative? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus presents us with commandments about loving our enemies, about forgiving, about giving generously, about not worrying. All those commands are beautiful. They're some of the most memorable in the whole Bible, some of the most commonly known. And the one thing I hear from both Christians and non-Christians alike when we talk about the Sermon on the Mount is it's really impractical. You can't actually love your enemy in this world without getting destroyed. And to a degree, you're right. In a world that's dangerous and chaotic and threatening, loving your enemy makes little sense. Which is why Jesus begins the Sermon on the Mount with a different vision of the world. He begins with the Beatitudes, reminding us that the people who the culture said were cursed by God are actually blessed by Him. He reminds his listeners that the poor, the forgotten, the marginalized, the mourning, they are indeed blessed by God. Dallas Willard talks about this, and he says the Beatitudes are there to remind us that this is indeed a God with us world. And in a God with us world, we are perfectly safe. That those committed to Christ are eternally and forever in His care. And once we have that vision of the world, a place of safety rather than threat, we can find the courage to do otherwise unthinkable things, like not worry and give generously and forgive abundantly and even love extravagantly those who would threaten us. But it begins with having a different vision of the world. 2 days ago, we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and his story, from a more contemporary point of view, exhibits the kind of transformation we need to have if we are to love those who others are calling our enemies. King, before he was a well-known civil rights leader, of course, was a Baptist preacher. In 1956, he found himself in Montgomery, Alabama, leading a bus boycott. Threats to his life occurred almost every day. But on the night of January 27, 1956, he was awoken in the middle of the night by a phone call, and the voice threatening him, telling him that if he and his family were not out of town in 3 days, they were going to be killed. King later recalls that night he couldn't go back to sleep. He said that he was scared to death, paralyzed by fear. Instead, he stayed up that night with a cup of coffee in his kitchen, thinking about his infant daughter and his wife in the bedroom next door, wondering how he could possibly get out of Montgomery and save face and not get killed. That night, over his cup of coffee, however, he experienced something he hadn't expected. He said that he felt something. He heard an internal voice. If we were all Methodists, we would say that his heart was strangely warmed. And he said the voice spoke to him and said this: "Stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you, even until the end of the world." The voice promised King, quote, never to leave me alone. No, never alone. He promised to never leave me, never leave me alone. That night in King's kitchen, he experienced the reality of a God with us world. And it was what he needed to enact the peaceful resistance that he had theologically and philosophically believed in, but had not yet found the courage to actually enact. And it was tested a few nights later when his home was bombed while his wife and daughter were inside. The house still on fire, groups in front of the home, the black community in Montgomery, Alabama, ready to riot in response to this attack, and King standing on his porch, declaring to them to put down their clubs and their bats and their rifles, and instead love the ones who did this. That courage came to King because he was convinced that God was with him, and that he was safe in this world that was threatening him every day. If we are to meaningfully change the dialogue, to change the interaction between Christians and Muslims in the world that says it's a clash of civilizations, it begins with those of us who claim Christ to have an experiential, powerful commitment to Christ with us. We need to not just have a political tactic or a social engagement. We need to have a spiritual awakening so that the fears that are put upon us day in, day out about the Muslim community can be replaced instead with divine love. But that will only happen when we become convinced that this is a God with us world. Second great obstacle, I'll keep this one shorter. The second great obstacle is that of loyalty. Somehow we've come to believe that if we meaningfully cooperate with people of other faiths, it's somehow disloyal to Christ and his gospel. Now, there's two great flaws in that logic. The first is that that mindset comes out of 100 years or more of thinking that we can go it alone in our culture, that we have enough power and influence as the church in North America that we don't need to cooperate with people of other faiths to tackle the problems in our world. Well, those days are over. If we want to meaningfully tackle most of the major problems facing us in our local communities and certainly internationally, we've got to learn to cooperate with people who don't agree with us theologically. We could talk about poverty, homelessness, AIDS, malaria, sex trafficking, failing schools, violence, fatherlessness, you name it. None of those issues can be tackled meaningfully with just the church engaged. The church needs to be there, but we also have to engage our neighbors of other faith. The second great error in this thinking is it comes out of 100 years or more of the American church being bifurcated along liberal and fundamentalist lines. The modernist fundamentalist controversy that happened in the early 20th century said that if you want to meaningfully engage with people of other faith, the liberal side anyway, said you need to diminish your distinctives of your own belief system, find the lowest common denominator, agree that all paths lead to God, and cooperate with others. This led to an ecumenicalism, which some have called ecumenia. Just unite with anyone, regardless of what they think or believe. The other side responded to this. The fundamentalist side said, no, we're going to hold to the fundamentals of Christian faith, but that means we're not going to engage or participate with those who disagree with us. So on the one side, you can engage with people of other faith, but it means denying your Christian distinctives. On the other side, you hold on to your Christian distinctives, but deny working with people of other faiths. This has done irreparable harm in some cases to people when they engage the wider culture that's pluralistic. I see it happening in young people in the church today. They are given no meaningful alternative. They feel like if I want to meaningfully engage people of other faiths, I have to deny my Christianity, or if I want to hold on to my Christianity, I need to isolate from meaningful engagement. What we need to do is begin to pave a new path, a third alternative. One which says, no, you can hold to your Christian identity, you can remain faithful and loyal to the gospel of Christ, and engage people of other faiths in cooperative work for the common good. Unfortunately, there are so few examples that we can really point to in our culture of people doing that young people aren't given a model for what that looks like. We need to begin showing that cooperating with other faiths does not equal disloyalty to Christ or the gospel. In fact, it's just the opposite. That it is because of our loyalty to Christ and his work in this world that we cooperate. Another way of putting it is, the reason why we need interfaith cooperation is not because we believe all faiths are the same, but precisely because we believe they are not. And yet we still share this world and must learn to cooperate with one another. Francis modeled this beautifully in his interaction with the Sultan. He went in identifying himself as a Christian, sticking to his beliefs as a Christian, but out of respect and care for his Muslim neighbor, he engaged around issues of faith in a respectful manner. So the world is being told that the only option for Christians is conflict, a clash of civilizations. As an evangelical, and speaking with evangelicals, my message is it doesn't have to be that way. If we have a true encounter and presence of Christ with us, our fears can be taken away and replaced with even irrational divine love for our neighbors. And secondly, if we begin to pave a different way between the modernist fundamentalist, the liberal fundamentalist divide that's happened in the American church and show that you can be faithful to the gospel and cooperate with others, then real cooperation is possible with fidelity to the gospel. And my hunch is that if, like Francis, we find that courage, when we cross those cultural battlefields, we will probably find a great deal of Muslims of goodwill on the other side, just as he did in the Sultan. Let me end with this final story that's come from the news recently. It gives me hope that such positive interaction is possible. On New Year's Day, there was a bombing in northern Egypt, actually not far from where Francis and the Sultan had their engagement. 23 Coptic Christians were killed in a church when a suicide bomber came into the space and set off the bomb. 6 days later, when the Coptics celebrated Christmas on January 6th, the church gathered to worship. But all the Muslim neighbors in that community gathered around that church and created a human barrier around the church to ensure that the Christians could worship without fear of another bomb. Did the Muslims and Christians agree theologically? No. But what that bomber, or the people behind the bomber, wanted to do was incite violence and hatred and retaliation between these two communities. And both the Christians and the Muslims said, no, we are not going to succumb to the clash of civilizations narratives. We are going to choose a different path. And though we disagree on important issues, we're going to stand up for one another and love each other as neighbors. That's a model of the kind of cooperation that's possible when we don't succumb to the narrative that the world is trying to push upon us. Thank you for those few minutes. We'll have time to engage it more and ask questions and interact, but let me introduce my friend Eboo. I'm sure he has plenty to share on this topic as well.
First, let's thank Skye. I could listen to you preach all day. So I want to connect with two things that Skye said. The first is this idea of the growing religious diversity all around us. I was just at the College of DuPage today. I grew up, 4 miles from here. In fact, Mr. Tillman, one of my high school teachers, is in the audience. I wonder if you're going to give me a grade after I'm done with this, actually. I was at the College of DuPage where I took some classes when I grew up, and I'll tell you something, it looks a lot different than when I was in high school 15 years ago, right? My mom, who teaches at the College of DuPage, tells me that probably 60% of her students are people of color or recent immigrants, right? Well, I felt very frequently like the only brown kid in town when I was growing up in Glen Ellen 20 years ago. The world is changing, and Bill Moyers tells this funny story about this. He tells a story about two guys in a bar. The Muslim version of this is there's two guys in a cafe. We don't drink, we don't go to bars in California, and one, the guy with the long beard and the extra dark coffee says, "Do you know anything about Eastern religion?" And the one with the straightforward haircut says, "Yeah, I knew some Methodists when I lived in Philadelphia." Right? So that story is about a different era in America, right? Because whatever you think Eastern religion is, it's probably not Methodists in Philadelphia. Right? America has become, probably, scholars like Diana Eck from Harvard tell us, the most religiously diverse nation in human history. So just stop and think about that for a second, right? There are more people from more different religions who have gathered in this political entity than in any other political entity at any time in human history, right? I mean, Barack Obama speaks about this beautifully in the inaugural address. Our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Hindus and Jews, Buddhists and non-believers. And because we have known the bitter pill of civil war and segregation, we believe that the next chapter in global history will reveal our common humanity in ways that the previous chapter didn't. Okay? There's huge religious diversity in this country. Part two, America is without a doubt the most religiously devout nation in the West. So every single survey shows that rates of attendance at worship, rates of belief in God are 2, 3, 4 times higher in the United States than in Canada, France, Germany, England, Australia, our kind of sister post-industrial countries. And we live at a time in which the dominant narrative about religion, as Skye said, is the clash of civilizations. Right? I like to call it, there's 3 things. Either religion poisons everything, religions are fated to fight, or the Muslims are coming to get you. Right? Most religiously diverse nation in human history, the most religiously devout nation in the West at a time of global religious conflict. So who are we going to be? Right? Who are we going to be? Are we going to let what's happening between Sunnis and Shias in Baghdad, what happens occasionally between Hindus and Muslims in Bombay, the tension that still exists, and I was there just last year, between Catholics and Protestants in Belfast, are we going to let that pattern relationships between their diaspora communities in Boston? Or are we going to be America, right? That nation that John Winthrop, when he sailed across the Atlantic on the Arabella, spoke to his compatriots about. We shall rejoice together. We shall suffer together. We shall labor together. We shall be, as a city upon a hill, a beacon to the world. Right? The only way we get there from here is, as Skye said, to tell a different story about what it means to be religiously diverse together. There's this beautiful line in Susan Sontag's Jerusalem Prize address. Whatever is happening, there is always something else going on. Whatever is happening, there is always something else going on. If there is a dominant narrative in the news about religious conflict, I promise you there is another story about interfaith cooperation. My guess is that every single person in this room knew the story of the terrible suicide bombing in the Coptic church in Egypt. My sad hypothesis is that far fewer knew the story of the hundreds, maybe over 1,000 Muslims, including the most popular evangelist in the most popular television personality in the Muslim world, Amr Khalid, the sons of Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt, who came to be human shields at that Christmas service some weeks later. That's that other story. What I want to do in the next 15 minutes is tell some of those other stories. And by telling these other stories that have happened either in contemporary times that I've witnessed or an alternative narrative of how I understand Islam vis-a-vis the rest of the world, what I hope happens is that an alternative narrative builds in your head, right? Is you start seeing the world through this alternative lens. Beautiful line in the work of the French poet Marcel Proust. The true journey of discovery is not in getting to new landscapes, it's in developing new eyes. The eyes that I want to offer are the eyes of interfaith cooperation. Let me tell you these two stories. So, as Skye and Mr. Tillman and others who I might have known in high school will probably freely tell you, I've spent much of my life trying to gain a ticket into the liberal elite. And if you want to go to the Aspen Ideas Festival, it will cost you $2,000, which I don't have. So I snuck in. Now, I snuck in to see Rick Warren speak. Right? And the funny thing is, this kind of drove my liberal elite friends in Chicago a little bit nuts. Why would you sneak into the Aspen Ideas Festival to see that whack job fundamentalist? Right? And the funny thing is, they think that they're so multicultural and diverse that they have positive opinions about Muslims, but yet they'll take 30% of America who is evangelical Christian and call them whack job fundamentalists. That was a different conversation that I had with them. I sneak in, I sit in the back, and Rick Warren, probably the most prominent evangelical Christian in America, right? Some say he's the heir to Billy Graham. He opens by saying, I want to thank you for inviting me to this stage. I think that the currency of ideas is perhaps the single most important currency that we traffic in as fellow Americans. And I want to talk to you about my idea of the church's engagement with the world. And he talks about what Saddleback Church is doing in Rwanda, right? And he talks about his kind of kairos, his awakening experience of, man, he had built this massive church, tens of thousands of people, something like 80 acres, right? And they had sat silently, as frankly most of the world did, when 800,000 people were slaughtered in 100 days in Rwanda. And Rick Warren goes to that country and he meets the president and he weeps before him and he says, I am coming to a new understanding of what it means to be a Christian by seeing the experience of your people and asking myself how I should have been more deeply engaged in that. And I'm so moved by this, you know. And what's shocking to me is these people at the Aspen Institute who went to some of the fancy schools that I did and who read some of the fancy literature and philosophers that I read, all they wanted to talk about was where they disagreed with Rick Warren. They literally ignored his whole moving talk on the American church and Rwanda and how the broader American population could be involved in a deeper engagement with Africa, right? It was a conversation about development. People were standing up and saying, so why do you think that I, as a non-Christian, are not going to the same place you are when I die? Why are you on the different side of the debate on life choice issues than I am? And Rick Warren kept saying over and over again, I didn't come here to have this disagreement with you. It's not that that doesn't exist for me. It's I want to use this conversation as an opportunity to find agreement. And I'm thinking to myself, why can't we do that more? Right? Why can't we tell the alternative story of where your values and my values overlap? Why are we so quick to go to the disagreement? And I talked to Rick Warren afterwards, and he said, you know where I'm going after this? I'm getting in my 4-year-old Ford, and I'm driving to the Aspen airport, and I'm flying to Denver, and then I'm flying to New York, and then I'm flying to Rwanda. And I wish I could bring some of these people with, because I want us to experience the theology of the hammer. I want us to experience the community of what it is to work together to better other people's lives. That's the conversation I think people from different religious backgrounds ought to be having. What is it that we have in common? And the single most important question about that is, how does your religion or your philosophical tradition inspire you to serve others? Let's begin with that. Second story. I went to a conference in Australia, an Interfaith conference, and there was the television cameras were there, and politicians were there, and what that means is they had to make it colorful. Okay? And here's what colorful means in an interfaith context. It means you get somebody as far on one side of the spectrum as possible, and from one religion, and you get somebody from a different religion as far on the other side of the spectrum as you can, and you put them on stage, and it's a cage match, right? And the guy that they got who was a Muslim was like 6'6", beard down to here, dark as night, tattered brown robe with a wooden staff. And I'm like, dude just walked out of a cave, right? Like he's like the picture of the 12th century medieval Muslim, right? And I'm sure the television cameras were like, oh, we are gonna love this, right? And the Christian guy that they got, South Asian guy, nice crisp suit, and put him on stage, and the Christian guy goes first. And he says, my experience in Pakistan is that I never met a single Muslim who was nice to me. In fact, I only knew Muslims who harassed me. They harassed my wife, they harassed my daughters, they burned our church at one point. And the only thing that I am grateful for is none of them truly followed the Prophet Muhammad. We Muslims say, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him. Because the Prophet Muhammad would have commanded them to be even more violent than they were to me. Okay, so I started an interfaith organization, right? And I'm like the nice interfaith guy, and my throat is tightening. And now I'm glad that my dude has a wooden staff. And he's the scary-looking guy, right? And I'm like, wave that beard at him, And like, I am literally writing down the verses of Deuteronomy I know that speak of violence. And I'm with crusades, and I'm underlining it. I'm like, you tell him how violent his religion is. And the Muslim guy, true story, looks at him and says, I respect and love Jesus too much to say bad things about that prophet. And I admire Christianity too much to say bad things about that religion. And I only wish that I was present in your Pakistani city so I could have preached Islam to whatever Muslims who were unkind to you. and that room just changed. And the striking thing to me was how simple that was, right? I mean, basically, this guy just chose the simple path of not fighting fire with fire. He chose the simple path of saying, whatever you say about me and my religion, I am not, as the Quran commands me, to allow hate to let me swerve from goodness. Right? I am going to do what the Prophet Muhammad did, which is to speak admiringly about your religion. It's really a simple thing. Right? And that's the second way of talking that I want to commend. The first is to say, what are the areas that we share? I think the most profound of which is service. And the easiest question is, what about your religion inspires you to serve? Tell me something you're proud of about your religion. And the second is, let me tell you what I admire about your faith. Whatever you might say about my religion, right? Let me tell you what I admire about your religion. Because in 2,000 years of Christianity, or 1,400 years of Islam, or several thousand years of Judaism, if I can't find something that I admire, well, frankly, that says a lot more about me than it does about the tradition. Right? There is this beautiful line that Sufi Muslims say of Jesus, that when Jesus was in the market and people around were insulting him, in return, he blessed them. And when he came back to his disciples, and his disciples asked, why and how do you bless people who insult you? And Jesus said, I give only what I carry in my purse. I want to tell two more stories and draw a couple more lessons before closing. Here is one story. It's along the lines that Skye was talking about, which is, what is our Christian obligation to those who are different? Right? And when Skye was telling that, I couldn't help but think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Is that a familiar name to anybody here? All right, well, so Bonhoeffer, right, German patrician, aristocrat, grows up in the church, comes and studies at Union Theological Seminary, takes the last ocean liner heading from the United States back to Europe to act as a witness against Hitler's madness. And one of the things I find so rich about Bonhoeffer is that this pacifist created an assassination plot to take out Hitler. And he felt that his cost of discipleship, his Christian commitment, required him to do that. And there is a moment in Bonhoeffer's life that I think is one of the great utterances of the 20th century, Christian, Muslim, secular, whatever. One of the great lines is at a moment of particularly violent encroachment of the Nazis into Jewish neighborhoods, right? The smashing of shops, the intimidation of women and children, the beating and killing of men. And Bonhoeffer gets on German radio the next day, and he says, those who did not speak out for the Jews do not deserve to sing Gregorian chants. There is a justice requirement which precedes the privilege of worship in Christianity. Reminds me of a young intern who interned with us at the Interfaith Youth Corps this summer. I swear, I didn't hear Audrey say more than 10 words all summer long. A couple of my colleagues here from the Interfaith, did you guys hear Audrey say more than 10 words? She's this like kind of mousy, quiet intern, right, who came from a pretty small community in rural California, described herself as a conservative Christian, read a couple of books on interfaith cooperation in a college class and decided that this was something that she felt called to as a Christian. And so she came to intern for us at the Interfaith Youth Corps, the organization that I founded, and participated in the projects that we have young people lead, which are interfaith service projects, And when I met with the interns at the end of the summer, I said, what are you going to do when you go back to your community? And Audrey actually didn't have any ideas. She's like, I just don't know what I would do back in the relatively homogenous community that I'm from. So she gets back, and a couple months later, she gets an email that goes to all the lay leaders of her church, 10 reasons why Muslims can't be American. They worship the moon god Allah, and therefore will never pledge allegiance to the American flag, and 9 other such things. And Audrey looks at this and says, I just don't think that this should be going around a church, right? And so she sends an email back and says, I interned at this interfaith organization over the summer, and I made friends with Muslims, and I learned something about Islam, as I did with Jews and Judaism, and Baha'is and the Baha'i faith, and secular humanists and secular humanism, and I did service projects with them, and I came to respect them, and they're my friends, and there are beautiful things in Islam. Right? And she sends this to the lay leaders of her church. And here's what she got back. Where's your Muslim costume? Do you go to Mecca University? Are you going to learn to hate like they taught you to hate? Audrey had grown up in this church. I want you to think about this, right? I mean, a lot of you go to church. A lot of you have grown up in your churches. You live in a community probably not that dissimilar to the one Audrey lives in Wheaton, right? Imagine the people that you know who taught Sunday school to you, whose kids are your best friends. Imagine getting this from them. Audrey left the church. She's like, what? I can't show up at this place. And I felt terrible, right? Because at like some deep level, I was like, wow, this experience at the Interfaith Youth Corps made her say this in this email, and it caused this reaction. And there's like big fights in the family because do her parents still go to this church? That's the discussion. Audrey's like, I can't go. Well, her parents are like, well, we helped build the church. Are we going to stop going? So I call Audrey, and I'm like, hey, I just want to, are you okay? I'm so sorry about what happened to you. She's like, it's been really tough. She's like, I literally emailed with these kids 4 days ago. And they're not talking to me anymore, right? And she said, but I've been reading the Bible, and I have to tell you, Eboo, I feel like it's the most Christian thing I've ever done. It sounded like something Bonhoeffer might be proud of. Right? I want to close with a story from the Quran. So in the Holy Quran, in chapter 2, Surah 2 is what we call it. Here's the creation story. God takes a lump of clay and gives it his breath, and that's Adam, the first prophet, the first human being, the representative of all humankind. And God says to Adam, you are my abd and khalifa, my servant and representative upon the earth, my vicegerent, steward. Right? This beautiful creation. You're the one who takes care of it for me. And God says to the angels, come, I want you to bow to Adam, the first human being, the one who I've made the steward of creation. And the angels say to God, why would we bow to a creature who will only fiddle and destroy? And God says to the angels, I know what you do not know. Just pause for a second. I find that, I remember in my coming back to faith, reading that passage, and just, it was one of those moments where I had to put down the Holy Quran and just like breathe several times. Because what God was doing was vouching for our goodness to the angels, right? I know what you do not know. I gave this creature my breath. And God sets up a contest between Adam and the angels. God says to the angels, I want you to name the different parts of creation. And the angels say to God, the only knowledge we have is knowledge to sing the glories of your name. And God turns to Adam and says, you name it. And Adam can do it. the birds and the forests and the ocean and the animals. Adam can name the different parts of creation. What was that great goodness that God gave us? What was the nature of creation that God asked us to steward? It's diversity. What could we do that the angels couldn't do? Name that diversity. Beautify it with language. There's a line in the Muslim tradition, God is beautiful and loves beauty. And there's line after line in the Holy Quran about the beauty of diversity. God made us different nations and tribes that we may come to know one another. Verily, the one that's highest in God's eyes is the one that does the most goodness. God says to the Prophet Muhammad, I sent you to be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds. I know that this is not what many of you know of Islam. This is what I know of Islam. This is what Sontag was talking about. Whatever is happening, whatever is in the headlines, there is something else going on. This is how the vast majority of us understand this tradition. Right? The classical Muslim scholars would teach their students this. If you are merciful to those on earth, the one who is in heaven will be merciful to you. The most common Muslim prayer, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In the name of God, the all-merciful, the ever-merciful. Final story. I gave a talk at the Centennial Convention of the American Jewish Committee a couple years ago. And I was on, plenary panel, youth voices of hope kind of thing. And one of the other people on the panel was a young woman from Rwanda, Yvette. And she said to me, why are you here? And I'm like, I'm the Muslim guy. I'm the Muslim interfaith guy. And she looked at me, she said, you are Muslim? And I'm like, yeah. And she reached out and she touched my hand and she squeezed it, and I could see tears in her eyes. And I'm like, what just happened? And she's like, my people are alive because of your people. My family is alive because of Muslims. And I'm like, really? And I went and Googled it, Muslims in Rwanda. Right? Perhaps the only organized community who combated the Interahamwe, hand against machete, protected the Tutsis of Rwanda in their mosques, in their basements, in their attics, in their backyards, were Muslims. Whatever is happening, there is always something else going on. A couple years later, I ran into one of the leading muftis of Rwanda, and I asked him, I said, Wayne, you did this? And he said, of course we did this. I said, why do you do it? Tell me why. He said, we're Muslim. Mercy, mercy. We were just trying to be merciful. And we take that as a lesson, to just try to be merciful. Thank you.
It's my understanding we're going to have a time for Q&A. There's 2 mics up here, and we're going to get in just a second, but we wanted to give an opportunity to respond. So do you want to ask a question of me, and I ask a question of you, and then we'll open it up in case there was anything from our talks that we wanted to directly respond to?
So, yes. When you talk to extremely intelligent evangelical Christians about interfaith cooperation, especially with Muslims, and they ask you the very pertinent question of, but I keep reading about Muslim extremism. Half the newspaper, the New York Times, is Muslim extremism, right? How can I cooperate with these people? What do you tell them?
I'll answer that with a story, since that seems to be the theme tonight. Very shortly after 9/11, I was speaking at a church in the area here with I think it was a college group. It was a big church, large college group, and of course, I had been scheduled to be there before 9/11 happened, so I came and spoke on something completely unrelated. But afterwards, there was a Q&A time, and because my background was one of studying different religions, I was a religion major in college at a secular university and spent a year studying Islam and other things. some of the leaders of the church wanted to ask me questions about Islam for this group of young Christian folks who are just their first real introduction to Islam is 9/11, which is not a good introduction. So they're throwing me these softball questions, the leaders of this Christian group, saying, well, isn't Islam a religion of violence? And doesn't the Quran justify attacking and killing people who aren't Muslim, and all these kinds of... And I realized what he was doing, because there were a number of young people in this audience who, as they had told me in advance, were questioning their Christian faith or debating what faith they should adhere to. And so they wanted to give me these softball answers so that I could hit them out of the park and just tell everybody that Islam is this horrific, evil, terrible religion. And of course, with 9/11 in the recent history, that's just an easy thing to do. So I realized what was happening. I got kind of irritated, because my personal engagement with Muslims had not been with the extremist sort. It's it's a unfortunate stereotype, and so I knew what they were trying to do, and I responded in a way which I slightly regret, a little bit, not entirely, but I got my Bible out and opened it up to passages in the Old Testament in which God commands Israel to execute large swaths of people. And my point, and I saw the pastor in the back, his eyes just got huge. And he's like, what are you doing? And I said, well, I just want you to see that we can take passages out of our scriptures, and if we take them out of context, we could say that Christianity or Judaism is also a religion of violence that justifies killing. And I said, there are people who are going to do that with the Quran and paint all Muslims with the same brush. I said, what we saw in 9/11 was some religiously motivated terrorists, but I don't think you should take just these folks and make it normative for all of Islam. Well, I got a chewing out at the end of that, because I didn't hit the softball question out of the park, and I was not invited back to the church because I wasn't willing to just paint another religion with a broad brush. So what I try to do is I try to help Christians see that we as Christians throughout history, and even in the contemporary world today, we're not monolithic. There are a great diversity of expressions of Christianity, some of which we are very proud of, like Bonhoeffer, and some which we are definitely not proud of, like the Crusades. So we can't just pick and choose what parts of Christianity we want to celebrate and then only pick those pieces of Islam or another religion that we want to condemn. There are things and histories and people and communities in Islam that are praiseworthy, even though we may disagree theologically, just as there are communities and times within Christianity which are not praiseworthy. So what I try to do is just help them realize that everything's a lot more complicated than what we might get presented in the New York Times, or we might get presented in a youth group in a church somewhere, where there's just no room or capacity for depth of investigation. So that's what I typically try to do. Make sense?
Perfect sense.
Okay, well, let me ask you this then, because speaking of the image of Islam in the West right now, in a number of the controversies that have arisen in the last decade since 9/11, one of the things we hear regularly is, where are the moderate Muslim voices? Why aren't we hearing more publicly, and why aren't we seeing a different face other than the extreme face? So, I mean, for a number of folks here who may not have regular engagement with Muslims, you're it, buddy. So I'd like to ask you that question, is what's your perception as someone within the Muslim community of, Islam is being presented in a very one-dimensional capacity right now. What do you have to say to others in your community who think more like you do, who would like to see a much more merciful and moderate perception of Islam presented?
Right, so I'm going to say a couple things, and then I'm actually going to ask the audience for some help on this, right? One is, I could literally name 100 Muslims who are public Muslims, right? Who speak, who have blogs, who have small books, some who have big books like Reza Aslan's book, No God But God, who feel like they shout themselves hoarse by not just saying, I think that the bombing of the Coptic church in Egypt is terrible, but who are proactively advancing an alternative understanding of Islam. And one of the questions we have is, why aren't you hearing us, right? And part of what the question, where are the moderate Muslims, it's kind of like asking somebody, when did you stop kicking your dog? Right? There's no good answer to that question because you've already framed the situation as I'm kicking the dog, right? So I feel like we start at a disadvantage with the question that you are assuming that the 1.4 billion Muslims in the world are silently acquiescent to the terrible things about the terrible things we see in the headlines about Islam. Let's say two detailed things about this. Here's detailed thing number one. Why just kind of an open contemporary history question. In the contemporary world, which is to say post-World War II, anybody know which movement invented suicide bombing? I would say post-World War II, post the Japanese kamikazes. What? That's right. The Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. Okay. By the way, this is not a small, insignificant group. They blew up an Indian prime minister with a 16-year-old girl in the late 1980s, right? They very much sought to do public, terrible things. And the Tamil Tigers actually don't exist anymore because the Buddhist government destroyed them in the last couple of years. But when they did exist, they were very angry at Muslim suicide bombers because they thought to themselves, why are those guys getting all the attention? Literally, right? The world thinks that Muslim groups invented suicide bombing. There's a reason for this, because Muslim extremists videotape their suicide bombings. Think about how nuts this is. Somewhere in the hills of Pakistan or Afghanistan, there's Osama bin Laden, and he's got Qurans and Kalashnikovs and video cameras. Why is he taking the extra trouble to lug around video cameras? Because for him, the beheading isn't the thing. The thing is the videotape of the beheading. And what does he do with that videotape? He sends it to CNN. He sends it to Fox. He sends it to MSNBC. And what do? They play the videotape. So what we wind up seeing about Islam is the videotape of a beheading. Right? The point that I'm trying to make is those people are extremely intentional about what they're doing. They want you to think Islam is a violent religion. They want you to think the Muslims are coming to get you. So much quicker to a clash of civilizations if you can make the people on the other side pick up their swords first. Right? Here's the other detail I want to articulate. I got this question about 15 times over in Kansas City to the point where I got sick of it, and I was like, let me ask you something. What if the only thing I knew about Kansas City was the first minute of the 5 o'clock news for 50 straight days? I would walk into this town and be like, y'all are a bunch of thugs and murderers. Because all I know about Kansas City is the stories of thugs and murderers, right? Please don't get your news about a 1,400-year-old religion with 1.5 billion followers from the evening news or from the headlines in the paper, especially when extremist movements in that religion are trying to generate those headlines. Does that mean it's not a problem? Of course not. It's a problem. Right? Does that mean it doesn't exist? Of course it exists. Does that mean that that's the reality of the religion? That's where the first minute of the evening news analogy comes in. Here's my question for you, where I want your help. So, tonight in Chicago, there will likely be a lot of terrible things that happen. There might even be a murder, right? And tomorrow, if somebody from Kenya shows up in Chicago, they are likely not going to approach any of you and be like, why didn't you do something about that? But by some logic, they could. I mean, you live within 30 miles of Chicago. It is your community. You might call yourself part of the Chicagoland area, and it is somebody who also calls themselves part of the Chicagoland area who commits something terrible, right? And you could, you're local, right? You're proximate. So my question to you is, how should I respond to this question, right? What responsibility should I have as somebody who happens to pray in Arabic vis-a-vis people on the other side of the world who happen to commit terrible crimes, and they also pray in Arabic. I would seek your counsel on that.
With that, let's hear your questions. I mean, we don't want to completely take all the time for just our monologuing. So there are 2 mics. Come on up to the aisle and make sure you ask your question into the mic so everyone can hear. And you can begin with Eboo's question or ask one of your own.
Thanks for coming tonight. My name's Brian. I'm happy to be here and get to listen from you guys. It's a new perspective, so that's cool. I have 2 questions, I think, or maybe just clarifying ideas to think about. In response to your question that you just asked, I would say, personally, I don't know. I'm a Christian, so I don't hold people outside of our faith accountable to things in the Bible. If a Christian brother is sinning according to what I believe is God's word, I correct him according to God's word. I don't know what room the Quran permits for Muslims to judge each other in terms of what's permissible and what's not. So whatever justice is inherent in the Quran, I would start there. I just don't know what it is. The second thing is, I work in a North Shore school, which is a predominantly Jewish area, and most of my coworkers are Jewish. So I experience working alongside people of different faiths. There's a few Muslim students in the school I work at too. So I have daily encounters with people of very different backgrounds and cultures. And I don't think coexisting is a problem. But when it comes to the mission of either religion, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, I don't ever see how they're going to come to agreement on those. The church has a different mission, and the mission is belief and submission to Jesus. I don't know what Islam would say is its core mission or value statement. As far as I understand the Judaism I've experienced, it's a cultural heritage that you receive. I don't know what the mission would be for Judaism or Islam. I do believe that the missions are probably not going to be the same, though. So coexisting sounds easy compared to having a similar mission. So it's just a thought. It's not really a question, but so that's all I got.
Yeah, I think I don't anticipate there are going to be too many Muslims who want to cooperate with us in evangelizing the world for Jesus Christ. So that I don't think is, I think you're right on that. But I wouldn't say that's the entirety of our mission. I think part of our mission is to love our neighbors. It is to reveal the character and beauty of God in the world. It is to alleviate suffering. When going to the story of Adam, as you told in the Quran, and we think about it from the Old Testament, part of the commissioning of Adam and Eve was that they might have dominion over the earth and fill it, not just with people, but fill it with the beauty and order that was evident in Eden, and taking that beauty and order to all of creation. So the mission, I would expand beyond that. And I think there are elements of that wider mission that we can cooperate on. So when we see suffering, when we see injustice, when we see poverty, when we see homelessness, when we see all kinds of things that are plaguing our world, and even our immediate communities, I think it makes great sense to partner with people of other faiths and say, we both care about this family in our public school who's facing homelessness. We can partner together, a church and a Muslim community, to make sure that family doesn't end up on the street. That makes sense to me, and I think that's part of the mission of Christ, even though it may not be as explicit as proclaiming the gospel, which is a unique thing that only Christians may be able to do. So you're right. If you define the mission narrowly as just a proclamation of the gospel, there isn't room for cooperation. If we see the work of God in this world as broader than that, I think there's a great opportunity for cooperation.
I love that you, as an articulate, strong Christian, are working with Jewish teachers to teach kids from diverse backgrounds, some of whom are Muslim. And at least from my understanding of Christianity, I feel I see echoes of the legacy of Jesus in that service. So I actually think you're a model for what I'd like to see in the world.
Good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Imam Inamul Haq Kausar. I'm the Imam of Glen Ellen Mosque, and I'm very much pleased to hear that comments by both the speakers. It is excellent. As coming together is concerned, Muslims, Christians, and Jews been together for centuries. There are so many things common as Islam is concerned. We believe in the same God. Holy Quran says, tell them that your God and our God is the same God. And we all Muslims believe in the all, like Old Testament and the New Testament. And whenever we say the name of Jesus, we say alayhi salam, which means peace be unto you. We have all respect and honor. 36 times the name of Jesus is mentioned with all respect and honor. There's one complete chapter, or you can say book, in the name of Mary, with all respect and honor. So there are so many things that are common as Islam and Christianity is concerned. I think we should be talking about the commonalities. And this is what is need of the hour. And very recently, like last month, the month of November, we had Interfaith. I wish I should have invited you there. And there was a good gathering at our mosque. George Smith was also one of the speakers. We invited all faiths get together and talk about peace. And the topic was, how can we achieve love, peace, and harmony in our diverse society? And it went very well. The mayor of Wheaton also attended the convention, and there was Sandy P. Host, the state representative. I think this is what is needed, that all faiths get together and talk about the commonalities. I think we will overcome this problem, and it's not a very serious. There are so many things common, and I think we can work together, we can live together. And as religion, Islam means peace, I think it gives the message of peace. Our greeting is Assalamu alaikum, which means peace be unto you. And I'm sure that we Muslims hate nobody. And I belong to Ahmadiyya Muslim community, and I would say that we are in forefront holding the interfaith meetings all over the world. Since 1896 it started, and now in 1939, all over the world we are holding it. And this is what is needed, and I'm sure if we do have these kind of meetings, it will work very well. And thank you very much for your very good comments.
Thank you.
I don't really have a question in a sense, but I wanted to tell a short story, if you guys don't mind, because I think that this might be an example for people of what you guys are talking about. It's a really interesting experience. That was the main reason I came tonight. That's happened in my life in the past few months. A few months ago, I started tutoring a refugee from Eritrea, which is a country in Africa, about 50% Muslim, 50% Christian. And I began to realize over the first month or so that he was a pretty strong Muslim. He'd be talking and he'd start quoting the Quran about something and things like that. And near right before Christmas, our last tutoring session, he'd wanted to write a paragraph about the ideal society, what he thought the ideal society should be. And I told him he could, and he wrote this paragraph. And I read it right before I went home. And in that paragraph, he wrote that in the ideal society, we would all be so aware of God's blessings and mercy on us that we would turn aside from pride and envy and greed and live our lives humbly serving and loving other people, which to me was a beautiful statement of what I think God calls Christians to live, and better understanding of how I think God calls Christians to live than a lot of so-called Christians actually do or act. And so I went home over Christmas and I prayed, I sent out an email asking people to pray that I could have conversations with him, because I would, as a very conservative Christian, I would like to convert him to Christianity, but I also want to respect him, I want to talk to him. And I came back, and after Christmas we met. I went over to his place for the first time for tutoring, and he didn't want to do tutoring. He wanted to talk about God. He wanted to convert me to Islam, spend a lot of time evangelizing me, telling me that he believed that he could tell that I loved God, but he believed that I was deceived by Satan and that I was going to hell, which I told him, to some extent, I believed the same about him. And what that's turned into is, over the past month, we've been meeting once or twice a week, each of us working on reading the New Testament and the Quran, talking about it, praying about it, and also just spending a good time together, playing games, watching YouTube videos, hanging out. And I think that if more people would would try to do that, you could find that you can find people who believe very strongly, and even though you may believe they're wrong, you can see their heart and you can interact with them in a very personal way and really still strongly hold to what you believe, because we both admitted in, I think, our first conversation about God that we both wanted to convert each other, and we both didn't think we'd ever be converted. So that's just to encourage people to pursue and to actually develop personal relationships with others.
Thank you for sharing that. And it's a beautiful example, a modern-day retelling of Francis and the Sultan, in that most of us think that to have meaningful engagement with someone of another faith, we all need to deny our religious identity and keep it buried and not bring it forward. And there's an example of our religious identity is right out there. I'm a Christian, you're a Muslim. Let's talk about this, let's debate about this, let's learn about one another, let's respect one another, let's even try to convince the other person, but do it in a context of friendship and love, and that's exactly what we need to see modeled more.
First off, I'd like to say thank you to Mr. Patel for coming here to Wheaton College. I know it's a very Christian environment, and I really respect and appreciate you being here and the courage that shows. I guess my question...
I grew up around here, and I went to a concert here. When I was like, why is everybody so still? And somebody had to tell me why.
Yeah.
But thank you. It's great to be back.
I guess I'm interested in hearing both your sides on this question from a Christian perspective and also from the Muslim tradition. And that is, what do you see a place like Wheaton College, a Christian environment, what do you see organizations like the NAE and other Christian organizations, what do you see as their role in the future in terms of this interfaith dialogue, when it seems, coming from a Christian tradition, that we don't seem as concerned or as interfaith dialogue being that big of an issue? So I guess just from both your perspectives, what is the role of a place like Wheaton and larger organizations that represent the Christian tradition?
I'd say this for 5 years. I'm so glad you guys, my colleagues from the Interfaith are like, he's been telling us for 5 years. Now he's finally going to be able to tell them. So I think that evangelical Christians are the single most important culture-shaping community in America. Right? I think that the things that this country takes seriously, coast to coast and through the middle, are things that evangelical Christians take seriously. I think that in the last 30 years, many of the great people that America has produced have been evangelical Christians. I think Bill Hybels is one of these. I think Rick Warren is one of these. I think Bob Roberts is one of these. I think Brian McLaren is one of these. I think Jim Wallace is one of these. I think Joel Hunter is one of these. Here is why I think that. Because they have taken a tradition which is stereotyped as, wrongly, but stereotyped as narrow. And they have been able to connect the particular to the global. And your community has built institutions like World Vision that save more lives and heal more people and educate more kids than probably every other community on earth, with the possible exception of the Catholic Church. Okay? Many of you follow in the footsteps of the institution builders and the pattern-changing evangelical leaders of the past 30 years. Rick Warren, Bill Hybels, Jim Wallace, etc. And there are 4 things I think that this group of people brought to the center of the radar screen in the last generation: race, poverty, AIDS, the whole world. Right? And if you think about the various things that a lot of you guys are engaged in at Wheaton College, and I tweeted like mad about you people today, right? The Harvard of the Harvard of evangelical schools, the Harvard of Harvards, blah 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 blah. I was a mad tweeter today about Wheaton College. So here is my question to you: when a group of students is at Wheaton College in 2041, 30 years from now, what patterns will they be following that you have created? What institutions will they be improving that you have built? And what I want to submit to you is just as AIDS was a new and therefore signature issue over the past 20 years, of course it continues to be, right? And just as the engagement with race is frankly the signature issue of America for 300 years, right? And just as the church's engagement with the world has grown with galloping speed over the past 30 years, I think that the interaction between people from different religions is the core problem of our time. The faith line will be the challenge of the 21st century, and I do not see this world or this country coming anywhere close to solving this unless somebody in this room becomes the Bill Hybels of this issue, the Rick Warren of this issue, unless there is a world vision, a Sojourners, a Saddleback, a Northwood built to this. I think that evangelical Christians who right now, one of the most common discourses at interfaith conferences is, where are the evangelical Christians? And what I tell them is, oh, you have no idea, they're coming, right? And when they get here, when they realize this is a signature issue, you will do for interfaith cooperation what your community has done for AIDS, for race, for poverty, for the world. You will put it on the center of the American radar screen, and that's when we will start making progress. And I ask you this, begin soon. Begin soon, because lives are being lost as we speak, and this country and this world needs your leadership on this.
He's made a great case for it from outside the church. Let me make a case for it within the church of why this kind of cooperation is, and I touched on this earlier, but many of you have probably seen the statistics about the exodus of young people out of the church in America, and some people say, oh, it's inevitable, it's going to happen. The Southern Baptists right now are scrambling because for the first time in their history, their baptism rates are not even keeping up with the birth rate. So the largest Protestant denomination in the United States is shrinking. They're not even able to hang on to their own kids. So there's this exodus of young people out of the church, and everyone's trying to figure out what's going on, why is it? And I don't pretend to have the simple solution or answer to that, but I think one component of it is that for many generations now, we as the church have had this privileged position in the society, which means we have more or less had the luxury of being able to isolate ourselves from other groups and still function pretty well because we have created all of these institutions, whether they are colleges, schools, hospitals, you name it. Well, I think one thing we're failing to do is really prepare our young people for how to engage meaningfully in a pluralistic society. So they have an experience in the church, and this was sort of my experience growing up with one foot in the church and one foot out, is in the church I heard one vision of the world, but then I'd go to my public school, or I'd even go into my family, which was more diverse, and realize that that vision that I'm hearing in the church doesn't look at all like what I'm experiencing in the reality of this world. And so when young people grow up in this isolated vision of an evangelical world, and then they start venturing out into this very, very diverse world, they're unprepared. Apart from, I'm supposed to try to convert these people. That's pretty much the extent of what I was told about how to engage with people who aren't Christians. So somewhere along the line, we as the church, if we're hoping to make strides in retaining young people and giving them a different vision, we have to learn how to equip them to hang on to their identity as a Christian and yet engage meaningfully in a world in which that identity is going to be questioned continually. And it doesn't mean just giving them apologetics to defend it when it comes up at the lunch table. It means giving them resources rooted in their faith in Christ to cooperate with, respect, partner with, dialogue with, play Xbox with their friends and neighbors who are not of the same faith, without putting their identity as a Christian up on the shelf, but putting it out in front. So for me, this issue, it has global implications, it has national implications, but it has implications for the future health and mission of the church itself. If we don't start learning to listen to and cooperate and respect our neighbors of other faiths, we're going to short-circuit the bridges that can be built toward mission, and we're going to alienate the younger generation that's doing this intrinsically already in their engagement in the world when the church is silent on it. We've got to learn to talk about other faiths in a more robust way apart from they're wrong and we need to convert them. We can hang on to those theological distinctions, but we need to start talking about them in a more holistic way, as if they really are our neighbors and not just the object of our evangelism.
I think we have time for one more question.
So I guess my question is not particularly like I don't necessarily need like how to or like what to do in this situation, but just like how you two in particular have gone about like resolving this difference. So like when you have a friend who is a Muslim and they say to you, we basically believe in the same God and we just kind of disagree on Jesus. Like the people who disciple me, like my pastor or dudes who I looked up to growing up would disagree with that statement. I can understand like we're going to disagree on a lot of stuff, and what we're talking about is working toward like the common good as far as like service and stuff like that. But just how have you two, in your relationship, how have you gone about kind of discussing that, and then just in general, like what are some of the things that you've learned to help resolve conflict in a like non-violent, not saying like punching, but just like verbally violent way? That's my question. Cool.
I feel like I am crystal clear about where Skye stands on matters of dimensions of theology. And I feel like Skye is pretty clear on where I stand on those dimensions of theology, right? Which, for example, the nature of God, the role of Jesus, etc. And where we are, so if I were to ask Skye, he would be telling me things that I already know he thinks. And if he were to ask me, I would be telling him things he already knows I believe, right? That we believe. So therefore, I am just happy to disagree with Skye on that and think that I'm right. And I'm happy to know that Skye disagrees with me and thinks he's right. And here is a very important understanding of mine when it comes to interfaith cooperation. It is okay with me that Skye thinks he's right and that his belief is better than mine. You want to know why? Because I live in the real world. Of 6.5 billion people, and 5 billion of them think that their belief is different and better than mine. So if I don't just accept that, I am going to drive myself crazy. Right? And here is the deal I make with Skye. He knows that I think my belief is right and better or fuller than his. That's, I actually think, pretty simple. Right? It's pretty simple. And I don't ask Skye about where I'm going after I die because he doesn't control it anyway. So why do I care what he thinks about it? I tell this to my liberal friends who get their undies all in a bundle about, you know, what evangelical Christians think is going to happen after they die. I'm like, why do you care what they think? Why are you bothered by that? Why don't you spend your time admiring the fact that they're saving lives all over the world with the institutions they've built, because that's a big part of what they think they ought to do as Christians. Right? So what Skye and I spend most of our time talking about is the changing cultural manifestations of the religious communities we are a part of in America. That's what, from my perspective, what we spend most of our time talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we could certainly get into theological conversations and voice our differences. I mean, but like you said, I've studied Islam, you've studied Christianity. We know where we disagree, we know where we agree, and ultimately, it might be fun to have those conversations just to grow intellectually or challenge one another's ideas, but I'm pretty sure I'm not going to convince you by logical argument that you should become a Christian. And I'm pretty sure you're not going to convince me that I should give up my faith and become a Muslim. So on some level, you learn my Christian identity is not contingent upon him converting to Christ. And his Muslim identity is not contingent on me becoming a Muslim. So,
or your approval.
Or my
right?
approval, right. And so we simply look for areas of where can we or our communities cooperate on areas of mutual concern. And they're infinite. There are many, many areas. And as I said earlier, I don't see that in any way as being disloyal to Christ or his message, just as you don't see it as being disloyal to Islam. So somewhere along the lines, we need to get secure enough on our own identity as Christians that we can actually cooperate and work with someone else who thinks differently and may think we're wrong and not be threatened by that. And that's a challenge, especially for those of us who've had cultural privilege. We don't like it when more people in the culture than used to think we're wrong, and we tend to have tantrums about that because we want to say, no, we're not wrong, we're right. But our rightness doesn't come by having a majority. That's not what makes something right. So I don't need the majority of people in a room to agree with me to speak to them. I don't need the majority of people over sushi at lunch to agree with me in order for us to have that conversation. Remember the first time we sat down at a lunch together, my assistant editor was with me, and one of your colleagues was with you, and we were sitting in this little place in Hyde Park, and I think you were buying, so I felt like praying. It was the least I could do. I don't remember who was.
Is that going to be our deal for the rest of our friendship?
Something like that. So
I don't know. I think I'm getting the short end of that stick.
So I said, can we pray? And so I prayed over the meal, and we went out. We're having this great conversation, the four of us, and you halted, and you stopped me in the middle of our conversation, like an hour into it, and you said, Skye, I just want to thank you, because at the beginning, when you prayed for a meal, you prayed in the name of Christ. And I said, I'm a Christian, that's what we do. And you said, no. The fact that you were willing to own your identity as a Christian meant it was safe for me to own my identity as a Muslim. And that's what we mean by, let's own our identities, not suppress them and say, oh, I got to hide the fact that I'm a Christian because I'm with somebody who isn't, or I have to hide the fact I'm a Muslim because I'm with someone who's a Christian. Let's own our identities and not use it as, not apologize for who we are, but use our identity as a Christian, or in his case a Muslim, to justify our engagement with one another and actually draw from that love of neighbor or concern for the world or whatever to actually build a bridge. Faith does not have to be something that separates. It can be something, as you've said many times, that can bring us together, even though we fundamentally disagree on some very important issues. So, yeah, I don't know if that helped answer your question at all, but I do think that's the different model we need to present.
Let me tell a quick story about this. You told that great story of St. Francis and the Sultan. I'll tell you, for me, an archetypal story about this from Islam. So there's the story of this group of Christians who comes to the Prophet Muhammad, and they argue theology. And it's a heated argument, and it's about the nature of Jesus, right? Son of God or prophet, right? Which is the core theological disagreement. There are many, many, many of them, but that's the core one between Muslims and Christians. And it's a heated discussion, and at some point, the Christians look at their, whatever serves as a watch, probably the sun in 7th century Arabia, and say to Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, we have to pray. So will you let us take leave of your city so that we can pray? And the Prophet says, why are you leaving my city to pray? Pray in my mosque. And the Christians say, but we have just spent time arguing theology, this hugely core issue of theology with you. And the Prophet says, that doesn't mean that I am not going to provide you hospitality for your prayer. That doesn't mean I don't think that your prayer is beautiful. It just means that I disagree on this core element of theology. Right? This is, by the way, this is a hugely important story in what Muslims call the Sunnah, or the practice of the Prophet Muhammad. This notion of theological disagreement with the Christian group, and then in that same encounter, offering them a place for prayer. Right? So that's the paradigm that I seek to follow.
Well, I think our time is pretty much expended, so thank you all for coming out and listening. We're going to be around a little bit. I think, Eboo, you have a book table in the back.
Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, happy to. You should pick up his book. It is worth reading. And if anyone would like to dialogue a little bit more, I'm sure we'll stick around for a little bit and talk more. But thank you for joining us. I hope this was helpful.
Yeah, thank you. It was big fun. Take this on the road.
Let's do it again.